15 would be really easy because you use 4 and -4 to factor it. With something that's not a perfect square, the only factors we have with that are 1 and 5, or 1 and 15 and 3 and 5, and that's not going to add up to that 0. So all we need to do to solve this is, since the only variable we have in an equation like this is an x squared, what we can do with it is get the x squared by itself, and then to get rid of the square off of the square root, or square off the x, is we can use the square root. So we're going to use square roots to now solve quadratics, okay? And again, it works with something like this, because there's only one variable that has an x squared in it. On the equations where there's an x squared in the x, you can't use the square root, because one's x is squared and one is not. So that's why we use factoring primarily for that. But for these, we could factor a little bit. But for the most part, if you see an equation that just has a variable that's just x squared, we can use a square root to solve it. Okay. The big thing that when we do solve this, when you are using a square root to solve for x, with quadratics, we still need 2 answers, okay? And the reason why that is this next sentence that I have typed up there. The reason why we still are going to get 2 answers with the square root, because if you do the square root in your calculator, it's just going to give you one number. The square root of 15 is not even, but it's going to be something close to 4. It's going to be 3 point something high, okay? But we actually need 2 answers for every quadratic. So what the calculator won't give you is the second answer. And the reason why that is it just gives you the positive answer. But whenever you square root, we actually need both the positive and negative solution with each answer, okay? Where that comes from, if you just think about if you're squaring a number, if you take 4 squared is 16, negative 4 squared is also 16, okay? So when we have a variable in there and you're solving for it, you don't know if you want the positive answer or the negative answer, so we end up including both. So whenever you use a square root to solve for an x, you need both the positive and negative square root, okay? Now the calculator is going to help us find the positive square root, so you just also need to make sure that you include the negative answer. So you can either write them separately, so if you got like 2.45 as your square root of something, then another answer would be negative 2.45. So you should always have 2 solutions. So you can either write them separately like that, or you can either use the little plus and minus symbol in front of it, because if you plop that in front of the number, that's including both the positive and negative of that answer. Okay, does that make sense? So the big thing to remember is whenever you're using a square root to solve, the calculator will give you the positive answer, but we also need to include the negative answer with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and solve this one. So since x squared is our only variable, our first step is to get it by itself. So if we have x squared minus 15, with factoring we need it to equal 0, but with square roots, the difference is we actually need the square root to be by itself, or the x squared to be by itself, so then we can take the square root. So I'm going to take this 15 and add it over here. So this type of solving actually kind of mirrors a little bit of the solving we've done in the past where we had to get x by itself. So we got the x squared by itself. So now to get the x completely by itself, we need to get rid of this x put under 2, okay, which is called a square. And then the opposite of a square, or the exponent of 2, is a square root. So what we can do is we can square root both sides. All it's going to do over there with my x is get rid of the square. So I just have x by itself, which is usually what we want when we solve an equation of some sort. So this is my calculator. I'm going to do the square root of 15, which I believe up here, the square root, and some phone calculators also have started doing this. They put a little 2 in front of it. That's your square root. On my blue calculators, there's a button down here that says x squared. You do second that, that'll get you a square root. Up here, I have to set my number first. On the blue calculators, I have to do the square root first, so just make sure you know how to use your calculator. So I'm going to do square root of 15. And I usually like 2 decimal places, and I did say that in my sentence. So we're going to round to the 100th, so 2 decimal places. So I got 3.87. Okay. Now, like I said, the calculator will give us the positive solution, but we also need to include the negative solution. So one way to do that is write 3.87, and I can just write a comma, negative 3.87. Okay? So when you take the square root, you need to include both the positive and negative square root. So the calculator will give you the positive one, so then you also need to include the negative. So this is one way to write your answer. Now if you don't want to write the same number twice, just with a negative in front of it, the other way you can write that is just put a little plus and minus symbol in front of the 3.87. That's the other way you can write both the positive and negative solution. And I don't care, whichever way you like to write it is fine, but you always have to remember to include both positive and negative solution when you solve using square roots. Questions on the first one? So then the second one, again, exponents are only a variable, so I'm going to get it by itself. There's a couple ways to do it. I always kind of fall back to the traditional solving. So I'm going to add the 24 and then divide by 4. I know with our factoring, we divided that number first. You can actually do that sometimes. But I'm just like, so I'm going to fall back to my traditional solving method. So I'm going to add the 24 first. Then 4x squared equals 24. Then divide the 4. Either way, you should end up with x squared equals 6. What do I do now? Square root it. Yep. So x is going to equal, so the square root of 6 is 2.449, so I'm going to round that to 2.45. What do I always have to also have with my 2.45? Negative 2.45. So I like writing the plus and minus, so I'm going to do that now. So plus and negative 2.45. Okay? Or like I said, you could write it like this, 2.45 comma negative 2.45. So either one of those formats work. Questions on the first two examples? No. The next thing is new. Up to this point, if you've ever tried to take the square root of a negative in your calculator, what happens? Do you take the square root of a negative? No. It tells you an error. Okay? Essentially what happens though in certain branches of mathematics is we actually need to be able to program so that you can always find the square root of a number at any time. Okay? So what they've kind of created is kind of a fix for square rooting negative numbers. So it's called an I. So if you ever, that's why we don't really use I as a variable. One thing, it's kind of a hard variable. The other thing is we've defined it as something else. We've called it the imaginary unit. And what it allows us to do is actually take square roots of negatives. So this is called the imaginary unit. It's usually used with an italicized I. You don't have to do a little curve on it, but usually it kind of looks like that because I usually just italicize it whenever it's typed. And what it stands for is the square root of a negative. Okay? Essentially, it allows us to go ahead and take that square root. Essentially, you just have to take the negative off and just take the square root of the positive. But to show that originally the number was negative, you just have to include an I with your solution. That's kind of what this sentence is kind of saying. Okay, so if you get a negative underneath your square root, if you type it in as you see it, the calculator's not going to be able to do it. Okay? So essentially what we do is you take the negative off from underneath the square root, and you're going to replace it with an I outside of the square root in your problem. Okay? So we're going to continue to use that I to show that, okay, this number was originally negative, and you can't technically take the square root of a negative with your calculator. We're going to take the negative off, square root the positive number, and then just make sure you include the I with your square root. Okay, so I just have some quick square roots to simplify real quick. And then what you'll see is that this can show up within your solving process. So sometimes you might get x squared equals a negative number, and so we can still solve it. We just have to put an I with our answer. So if I got something like this, everyone with me? So if I take the square root of a negative, like if I just type it in as you see it, the calculator's not going to be able to do it. So I'm going to do this in 2 steps, but usually I do it in 1. So I'm going to take the negative off. I'm just going to make it an I. And I just put it outside the square root. I usually put it in front sometimes. Actually, most of the time I switch it to behind because that's typically where we write variables. But for this one, I just happen to write it in front. Okay. So the negative changes to an I. So now I can just go ahead and take the square root of 28, which is going to be 5.29. Okay, and you still have to make sure you include the I with it. Okay. Like I said, for some reason I just wrote the I in front of the square root. Most of the time I write the I behind because that's typically what we do with square roots. And then since it's a square root, I'll go ahead and put the plus and minus. So you always have to have positive and negative when you use square roots to solve. Now, if you have to take the square root of a negative, you have to include an I with your answer to show, okay, hey, this started off as negative, which technically you're not supposed to be able to do that. We're going to switch that negative to an I, and so I can actually square root it. So then something like this, what's going to happen to the negative? It's going to turn into an I. So really I'm just taking the square root of 81. What's the square root of 81? 9. So it doesn't always have to be a decimal. So the square root of negative 81 is positive and negative 9. Everyone understand why the I is shown up? So it's not going to happen a ton of times when you're solving, but every once in a while when you do solve, you might end up having to take the square root of the negative, and now we can do that just by using the imaginary unit. So let's do these last two examples, and then we have a little exit ticket. So what do we need to do first to solve example 3?
Subtract 14.
Yeah, we're going to subtract 14. What's 11 minus 14?
Negative 3.
So I get x squared is equal to negative 3. Now how do I get rid of the square? Square root it. Yep. Can I technically take the square root of a negative? No. So what can I do to the negative? Make it an I. Okay. And you don't have to write this middle step each time, but technically this is what I'm doing. I'm taking the negative off and I'm making it an I, and then I'm going to square root the 3. So it's 1.73. With an I next to it. Again, the I tells me that it was negative to start with, but I wanted to still take the square root, so I took off the negative, replaced it with an I. What else do I have to include as my answer? Plus and minus. Yeah. Okay. Now, if you don't like writing with the plus and minus symbol, you can still write it like this: 1.73i and negative 1.73i. So you can still write them separately like that, or you can just use the plus and minus symbol. Questions on 13? Oh wait, last one. What should we do first? Subtract 72. So we have 2x squared is equal to negative 72. Then what do we do?
Divide by 2.
Divide by 2, which is negative 36. Yep. Then how do I get rid of the square? Square root. Okay. So what's the square of 36? 6. Okay. What do I always have to have with my answer?
The I. Oh, the plus.
Plus minus always. Do I have to have I with this one?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Why do I have to have I with this one?
Because it's originally negative.
Okay. So always plus and minus. I if it's negative. There's my solution. Makes sense. So you do have a little exit ticket, and I actually did attach it to your note sheet this time, so you can go ahead and just do it on that blue paper. So when you're done with the exit ticket, just rip it off the blue paper, keep the front page, and turn it to the back page. And they also have a little worksheet